Imagine this, a quiet suburban neighborhood on a sunny afternoon. A black teen, just 16 years old, is riding his bike home after visiting a friend. He's minding his own business, his headphones on, a smile on his face. But as he turns the corner onto his street, the mood shifts. A neighbor, standing in her pristine front yard, eyes him suspiciously. Her gaze sharpens, and without hesitation, she picks up her phone and dials 911. She tells the operator there's a suspicious individual in the neighborhood. No crime has been committed, no real reason for alarm, but she insists on police intervention. Minutes later, flashing lights appear, and officers confront the teen. The neighbor stands at a distance, arms crossed, watching it all unfold with a self-satisfied smirk. But here's where the story takes a turn. What she didn't anticipate was a twist of fate that would leave her questioning her actions and the entire neighborhood talking. Karma, as they say, doesn't miss a beat. What happens next? Let's just say this story will restore your faith in justice and leave you cheering for the underdog. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss this. The police officers approached the teen with caution, their hands resting on their belts. The boy, startled and confused, removed his headphones as one officer began asking questions. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his tone firm but not outright hostile. The teen glanced around, unsure if he was being pranked or if this was actually happening. He replied, "I live here. I'm just riding home." The neighbor, still standing in her yard, raised her voice, interjecting, "He doesn't belong here. I've never seen him before, and he's been circling the neighborhood for hours." Her words dripped with accusation, her finger pointed at the teen like he was a criminal caught in the act. The boy, whose calm demeanor was beginning to crack under the weight of the situation, tried to explain. "I just moved in with my aunt last month. My house is right there," he said, pointing to a modest two-story home a few doors down. But the neighbor wasn't having it. "That's impossible," she snapped. "I know everyone around here." The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped back to radio in for more information while the other stayed to question the teen further. A small crowd began to gather, curious neighbors peeking from behind curtains or stepping outside to see what the commotion was about. Some looked concerned, while others simply gawked, their faces unreadable. Among the onlookers was an elderly man who lived across the street from the accusing neighbor. He had watched the scene unfold from his porch, his brow furrowed. Slowly, he shuffled down his steps and made his way toward the officers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gravelly but steady, "I know this boy. He's telling the truth. He lives with his aunt at 1421. The neighbor's face tightened. "How could you possibly know that, Frank? You barely leave your house," she retorted. But Frank ignored her, turning to the officers. "I've seen him coming and going every day. He's polite, says hello when he passes. I've never had a problem with him." The tension in the air was palpable. The officers, now unsure, asked for the teen's ID. He fumbled through his pockets and handed over a school ID with his name and photo, matching the address he had given. One officer walked to the house to verify the information, leaving everyone else standing in uneasy silence. But while the officers were focused on clearing things up, the neighbor wasn't done. "This is what's wrong with this country," she muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Kids like him think they can just do whatever they want." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Another voice chimed in, this time from a young mother standing nearby. "What's wrong with you?" she said, stepping forward. "You called the police on a kid for riding his bike home. Do you realize how dangerous that could have been for him? This could have gone so much worse." The neighbor bristled, but before she could respond, the officer returned. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone noticeably softer now. He handed the ID back to the teen. "You're free to go." The teen hesitated, looking between the officer and the neighbor. "That's it?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "She gets to call the cops on me for no reason, and nothing happens?" The officer glanced at the neighbor but said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked back to his car. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. The neighbor, now red-faced but unrepentant, hurried back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Over the next few days, word of the incident spread throughout the neighborhood. Some people defended the neighbor, saying she was just trying to keep the community safe. Others were outraged, calling her actions blatantly racist. The teen's aunt, furious about what had happened, organized a community meeting to address the issue. "This isn't just about my nephew," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "It's about the way we treat people who look different from us. This could have ended in tragedy." As the neighborhood grappled with its divided opinions, the teen tried to move on. But the experience had left a mark. He found himself looking over his shoulder, avoiding certain streets, and keeping his distance from neighbors who he once might have waved to. Meanwhile, the neighbor began receiving anonymous letters in her mailbox, some expressing support, others condemning her actions. One day, she found a sign planted in her yard that read, "Racism has no home here." Furious, she tore it down, but it only seemed to embolden her critics. What no one knew yet was that this story was far from over. The confrontation had set off a chain reaction that would force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their community. And as the neighbor's past began to surface, it became clear that her actions that day were part of a much larger pattern. But what happens next might surprise you. Because sometimes, karma doesn't just hit, it changes everything. Stay tuned for part 2, where the story takes an unexpected turn. As days turned into weeks, the aftermath of the confrontation rippled through the neighborhood like a stone tossed into still water. Conversations that had been avoided for years were now front and center, forcing people to pick a side. The teen's aunt continued to push for accountability, not just for her nephew but for the systemic issues the incident had highlighted. She reached out to the local community board, insisting they hold a forum to discuss racial profiling and bias in their area. The neighbor, however, refused to engage. She avoided eye contact with anyone on the street, her once chatty demeanor replaced by a guarded silence. Yet behind closed doors, she seethed. To her, the entire ordeal had been blown out of proportion. She felt like the victim, painted as a villain by people who didn't understand her good intentions. But karma has a way of forcing introspection, whether you want it or not. One evening, just as the sun was setting, the neighbor's doorbell rang. When she opened it, she was surprised to see the elderly man, Frank, standing there with a cane in one hand and a folder in the other. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. She hesitated before reluctantly stepping aside. Once seated in her living room, Frank placed the folder on the coffee table between them. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years, he began. "I've seen it change, grow, and yes, struggle. What happened the other day with that boy? It's not new, and it's not just you. But it's a problem we need to address." She crossed her arms defensively. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she said. "You can't blame me for that." Frank opened the folder, pulling out old photographs and newspaper clippings. "Do you remember the Johnson family?" he asked, sliding a photo of a black family sitting on their front porch toward her. "They lived here back in the 80s. Good people, but they left after their kids kept getting harassed. Same story, different decade." The neighbor glanced at the photo but didn't respond. Frank continued, "And the Ramirez family? Their youngest son got accused of breaking into a car that turned out to belong to his own father. They moved away too." Her defenses began to crack as she realized Frank wasn't here to attack her but to show her something she hadn't considered. "You see," he said, "this isn't about you personally. It's about a pattern, a history. And unless we acknowledge it, it's going to keep happening." The conversation stayed with her long after Frank left. For the first time, she began to question whether her actions had been justified or if she had been reacting out of bias she wasn't even aware of. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but it planted a seed of doubt that would eventually grow into understanding. Meanwhile, the teen's aunt organized a neighborhood event she called Stories That Unite Us. It was a potluck where everyone was encouraged to share personal stories about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. The goal was simple: to build bridges through understanding. At first, attendance was sparse, but word spread, and by the third event, the room was packed. The teen reluctantly attended the first potluck, standing awkwardly by the food table. But as he listened to neighbors share their stories, he began to see them as more than just faces he passed on the street. And to his surprise, they began to see him, not just as the kid who had been unfairly targeted, but as a person with hopes, talents, and ambitions. The turning point came when he stood up to speak at the fourth potluck. "I was angry," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Angry and scared. I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe in my own neighborhood again. But hearing your stories, it's helped. And I want to say thank you for giving me a chance to tell mine." The neighbor, who had been attending the events in silence, felt a pang of guilt hearing his words. She approached him afterward, her hands trembling slightly. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice breaking. "What I did was wrong. I see that now, and I'm sorry." The teen hesitated before replying, "I appreciate that." His tone wasn't overly warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was a start. As time passed, the neighborhood began to change not just in its attitudes but in its actions. A diversity committee was formed to ensure everyone felt included and represented. The teen's aunt became a prominent voice in the community, advocating for programs that celebrated cultural differences. Even the neighbor, once resistant to change, found herself volunteering at local events and engaging in conversations she would have avoided before. The incident became a cautionary tale but also a catalyst for growth. It taught the community that standing by silently wasn't an option and that even small actions could have lasting consequences. More importantly, it showed them the power of accountability, forgiveness, and the willingness to learn. In the end, the teen no longer felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood. He rode his bike with confidence, greeted neighbors with a wave, and began to rebuild trust. And the neighbor? She learned that protecting a community doesn't mean dividing it, it means bringing it together. The story didn't erase the pain of the past, but it did pave the way for a future where everyone felt they belonged. And in that, there was hope.